It was a stormy night when Emily first stepped into the Sterling Memorial Hospital for her night shift. She had been working as a nurse for over 2 years, but this hospital was different, not because it had state-of-the-art equipment or a renowned medical staff, but because something about it felt off. It wasn't the building itself, newer than most in the area, but there was an unsettling energy that hung in the air, as if the walls held secrets. When she was assigned to the night shift, she'd heard rumors from the other nurses. They were always quick to dismiss them with nervous laughter and a change of subject, but Emily could feel that something wasn't right. "Don't worry, it's just an old hospital," one of the older nurses had told her with a wink. "You'll get used to it. It's not the patients that get under your skin, it's the place itself. The hallways are alive with things you can't explain." Emily had dismissed it then, but now, standing at the nurse's station with the storm raging outside, she wasn't so sure. The corridors of the hospital were eerily silent. The lights flickered just enough to make her wonder if they were about to go out entirely. The hospital was nearly empty that night. Most of the patients had either been discharged or were in recovery after surgery. Still, there was a sense of isolation, as if the entire building were holding its breath. She scanned the assignment board, noting that she was assigned to the third-floor wing. It was the quieter floor, the one reserved for longer-term care patients, the elderly, and those recovering from serious procedures. She grabbed the clipboard with the patient charts and started down the hallway. The clicking of her heels echoed off the walls, and it was only when she reached room 312 that she began to feel uneasy. Room 312 was supposed to be occupied by an elderly man named Thomas Walker, a patient who had been admitted after a stroke. He'd been unresponsive for the last few days, but the doctors assured everyone he was stable. Emily checked her watch. It was nearly midnight, time for his regular checkup. The door to room 312 was cracked open, and Emily hesitated for a moment before pushing it gently. The room was dimly lit, the faint hum of a ventilator in the background, but what struck her immediately was the bed. It was empty. She stepped into the room, her breath catching in her throat. The covers were neatly made, as if someone had been there to straighten them out just moments ago, but there was no sign of Thomas Walker, no sign of anyone. The room was spotless, too spotless. Emily's heart began to race. Where could he have gone? He wasn't supposed to be able to get out of bed, not in his condition. She quickly glanced at the patient chart on the desk. It confirmed what she already knew. Thomas Walker had been here, under strict medical supervision, and his condition was not one that would allow him to walk out on his own. She checked the bathroom next, but it was empty. The closet, nothing. Her thoughts raced. Did someone move him? Could another nurse have taken him somewhere for tests? But no one had mentioned anything to her about him being transferred. She turned around to leave, but something caught her eye. A piece of paper, half hidden under the bed. It was a medical form, but it was old, not one of the typical records she'd expect to see. She knelt down and picked it up, squinting at the faded writing. Patient, Thomas Walker. It was a discharge form, but the date was wrong. It was dated 2 months ago. Why had no one told her about it? Her skin prickled as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. There was no way that this paper should be here. She was certain it hadn't been left by any of the regular staff. She quickly tucked it into her pocket, deciding to investigate further when her shift was over. But just as she reached for the door handle, a voice stopped her in her tracks. "You shouldn't be here." Emily froze. The voice was raspy, weak, like it came from someone who hadn't spoken in years. Slowly, she turned, her heart pounding in her chest. Standing in the doorway of the room was a man, pale, gaunt, and wearing nothing but a hospital gown. His eyes were wide and unblinking, staring directly at her with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Who are you?" she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The man didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, watching her with those cold, unfeeling eyes. And then, in a voice that was barely audible, he spoke again. "You need to leave, before it gets you too." This story seems to be getting scarier, doesn't it? If you want more stories like this, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. This helps create even more scary for you. Emily stood frozen in place, staring at the figure in the doorway. The man's eyes were unsettling, dark, hollow, as though they had seen something that no one should ever have to see. His words sent a chill down her spine, and for a moment, she thought she might pass out. But instead, she stood her ground, her training kicking in. Nurses didn't run from their patients, no matter how strange the situation. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice shaky but more forceful this time. The man didn't answer immediately. He just continued to stand there, his expression unreadable. His face was gaunt, his skin unnaturally pale, and the hospital gown he wore hung loosely around his frail body. There was something wrong about him, something that made her feel like he didn't belong here, like he wasn't supposed to be part of this world at all. "I used to stay in that room," he finally said, his voice rasping, as though speaking took all his energy. "Before they moved me, he trailed off, his eyes flickering to the floor, as if the memory was too much to bear. Emily didn't know what to say. She had never seen this man before in her life, but the way he spoke, the way his presence seemed to drain the warmth from the room, made her feel like she should know him, like she should have recognized him from somewhere. "Who moved you?" she asked cautiously, stepping back toward the door. "Where did they take you?" The man raised his eyes, meeting hers with an unsettling intensity. "You don't want to know," he whispered. Suddenly, Emily's phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the tension in the room. She jumped, startled by the sudden sound. Her heart was racing, and for a moment, she just stared at the man in the doorway, unsure of what to do. "Are you sure you want to know?" the man asked one last time, his voice a low, hollow whisper. Ignoring him, Emily pulled out her phone and glanced at the screen. It was a text from her colleague, Sarah, a fellow nurse who worked the night shifts with her. "Hey, I heard about Walker. He's gone missing again. The staff says he never checked out. Someone found his bed empty last night. What's going on?" Emily's stomach churned as she read the message. She had just seen Thomas Walker's bed empty, and now, it seemed like he wasn't the only one. "Walker?" she whispered aloud, glancing back at the man in the doorway. The man's eyes shifted, his lips curling into something that could have been a grin if it weren't so disturbing. "You shouldn't have come to this hospital," he muttered, stepping back into the darkness of the hallway. "You're already part of it." Before Emily could respond, he vanished into the shadows. With her heart pounding in her chest, she quickly exited room 312 and headed toward the nurse's station. The halls felt different now, darker, colder. It was as if the building itself was alive, watching her, waiting for her next move. Sarah's message had shaken her. Something wasn't right about what she'd just seen. The empty bed, the strange patient, and now Walker being missing. It was all connected. She had to figure out what was going on before she ended up like the man in the hallway, forgotten, lost, never to be seen again. Emily tried to push the thoughts from her mind and focus on her duties. She had a job to do, but as she made her way back to the nurse's station, she passed by another patient room, room 315. The door was slightly ajar. Curious, she paused and peered inside. At first, everything seemed normal. The lights were on, the bed was occupied, and the patient appeared to be sleeping, but something about the room felt wrong. There was an air of stillness, like the space itself was holding its breath. She took a step closer, her gaze lingering on the figure in the bed. The patient was an elderly woman, her face pale and wrinkled, her breathing shallow but steady. Emily could tell that this woman had been here for a long time, probably too long. It wasn't until she got closer that Emily realized something wasn't right. The woman's hands were clenched tightly around the sheets, her knuckles white, and her eyes were wide open, unblinking, staring at nothing. No, not nothing, at something. Emily froze. The woman's eyes were fixed on the far corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to deepen, where the light from the hallway didn't quite reach. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she stepped back slowly, unsure of what to make of the sight. It was as if the woman was watching something, or someone, but there was nothing there, just empty space. "Are you okay?" Emily whispered, stepping closer to the bed. She reached out to touch the woman's arm. but as soon as her fingers made contact, the woman's head snapped toward her, and she gasped. The woman's eyes were wide now, more intense than before, filled with an expression of terror that sent a chill down Emily's spine. You shouldn't be here," the woman croaked, her voice trembling with fear. It knows when you're close." Before Emily could respond, the woman's body went rigid, her eyes rolled back into her head, and she fell into an unnatural stillness. Emily stepped back, her heart racing in her chest. What was going on in this hospital? Why were these patients acting like they'd seen something that terrified them? Shaken, Emily turned and rushed to the nurse's station. She couldn't make sense of what was happening, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just a normal hospital, it was a place where something dark and twisted lingered in the corners, just out of sight, and she was starting to think that whatever it was, it had noticed her. Emily's hands shook as she grabbed the logbook at the nurse's station. She had to report the strange events she'd witnessed: Walker's disappearance, the woman's warning, and the ominous presence that seemed to follow her through the hallways. But as her eyes skimmed the pages, her heart sank. There was no mention of Thomas Walker missing. There were no notes about room 312 or the patients she'd interacted with. It was as if everything she had seen was being erased. "Sarah," she muttered under her breath. She quickly typed a message on her phone, asking her colleague to meet her in the break room. Emily needed answers, and she needed them fast. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in this place. The air felt heavier now, as though it were pressing in on her from all sides. It wasn't the weather or even the late hour. No, this was something else, something far darker. She had worked in hospitals before, but never anything like this. As Emily made her way toward the break room, she passed the elevator, and her foot froze mid-step. Something was off. There was a strange, almost imperceptible sound coming from the elevator shaft, like the slow scraping of metal against metal, a sound that shouldn't be there at all. She glanced toward the elevator, her nerves tingling. The doors were closed, but for some reason, they didn't look right. They were slightly ajar, almost as though they had been forced open and hadn't shut properly. Against her better judgment, Emily stepped toward it. The sound grew louder, more distinct, as if something was moving inside the elevator. She leaned in closer, her breath catching in her throat. The elevator was still and empty, yet there was something unsettling about it. Her eyes darted to the control panel. The button for the 4th floor was lit up. That floor was completely off limits to staff, locked behind a security code. It had been closed for years, ever since a string of unexplained incidents involving former patients. Her curiosity piqued. Emily pressed the button to close the doors. They slid shut with a soft hiss, and she stepped back, her heart pounding in her chest. Just as the elevator began to ascend, a loud bang echoed from within the shaft, followed by a rattling sound that shook the walls. Then, silence. Emily stood frozen, her breath shallow. She should have gotten off right then, but her feet felt glued to the floor, as if the elevator itself was pulling her deeper into its mysterious hold. She didn't even realize that the elevator had reached the 4th floor until the doors opened, and she stepped into the dimly lit hallway. It was unlike any part of the hospital she had seen before. The walls were chipped and cracked, the floors covered with a thin layer of dust. The air smelled musty, as if this part of the hospital hadn't been used in years. But what struck Emily most was the absolute silence. There were no beeping machines, no distant conversations. It was as if time had stopped entirely. She cautiously stepped off the elevator, glancing down the hall. The lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows along the walls. Something about this place felt wrong, not just abandoned, but forgotten, as if it were a part of the hospital that had never been meant to be remembered. Her fingers instinctively reached for her phone to call Sarah again, but the screen was blank, no signal. "Okay, Emily, think," she muttered to herself. "Just get to the end of the hall and back. You can do this." But just as she began walking down the corridor, she noticed something that made her stop dead in her tracks. At the very end of the hallway was a door. It was different from the others. It was closed tightly, and yet the faintest light glimmered through the cracks around the edges. The door wasn't part of any floor plan she had seen, it wasn't listed in any of the hospital's records. Without thinking, Emily moved toward it, her steps hesitant. She didn't know what she was expecting, but she knew she had to open it. She felt an inexplicable pull toward that room, an almost magnetic force that was beyond her control. Her hand reached out for the doorknob, and as her fingers touched it, she felt a sudden jolt of cold that made her pull her hand back. The door slowly creaked open. The room was small, no larger than a closet. Inside, the air was thick and oppressive, the temperature colder than the rest of the building, but what really caught her attention was the sight on the floor. There, in the center of the room, was a single bed, but it wasn't an ordinary hospital bed. This one was old, with iron bars on the sides, rusted and worn, and on the bed, in the dim light, was a man. He was lying perfectly still, his body covered by a thin sheet that barely concealed his gaunt frame. Emily took a cautious step forward, the hairs on the back of her neck standing up. She could barely make out the man's features, but his skin was so pale it seemed almost translucent. His eyes were closed, but something about his presence felt unnerving, like he was waiting for her to come closer. Without thinking, Emily bent down and reached for the sheet, her fingers trembling. She pulled it back, revealing the man's face. It was Thomas Walker. Her breath caught in her throat. He was supposed to be missing, but here he was, in a room that didn't exist on any hospital map, lying motionless on an ancient bed. The moment she saw his face, the room grew colder. The air became thick with something dark, something oppressive, and then, the door slammed shut behind her. She spun around, heart pounding. The room felt smaller, as if it was closing in on her. Panic gripped her chest as she tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. No, it wasn't locked. It was sealed shut. A voice, barely a whisper, filled the room. "You shouldn't have come." Emily turned back to the bed, her eyes wide with terror. Walker's eyes were open now. They were wide and glassy, staring straight into her soul. And then, he smiled. Emily's heart raced, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The man on the bed, Thomas Walker, stared at her with empty, hollow eyes. A smile spread slowly across his face, one that was more sinister than any grin she had ever seen. It was as if he wasn't just smiling at her, but something behind her, something she couldn't see. The room, now bathed in an unnatural cold, felt suffocating. What is this?" she whispered, backing away, her fingers trembling as she reached for the doorknob again, but the door didn't budge. It was as though it had fused to the walls, its wood warped and unyielding. Thomas's lips moved, his voice barely audible, but it sent a chill down Emily's spine. "It's too late, you've crossed the threshold. Now, you're one of us." The words reverberated in her mind, louder than the sound of her own heartbeat. The room seemed to close in around her. Every corner, every shadow, whispered of things she couldn't understand. As her eyes darted to the walls, she noticed something disturbing. Faded markings scratched into the paint, like desperate attempts to claw away from something, to escape something that had been here for far too long. Emily turned back to Thomas Walker, her body shaking. His smile hadn't wavered, but now his eyes seemed to glimmer with an unsettling knowledge, as if he had been waiting for her, waiting for someone who would come too close and realize the truth that no one was supposed to know. "Don't let it in," Thomas whispered hoarsely, his voice growing weaker, more distant. "Once it has you, there's no escaping." A low, humming sound filled the room, like the distant rumble of a machine, or something darker. Emily felt the pressure in the air intensify, as if the very walls of the room were breathing in sync with her. "It knows you're here." The thought entered her mind with a sudden clarity, and she turned again to the door, but before she could reach it, the room seemed to warp. The walls stretched and contracted, bending in unnatural ways. The shadows in the corners thickened, as if something was moving, slithering, just out of her sight. The temperature dropped even further, and she could see her breath misting in the air. Her heart pounded in her chest as she finally reached for the door again, this time with desperate force. She yanked at the handle, but it refused to open. Then, without warning, The walls began to groan loud, low, guttural sounds like an ancient building waking from a deep slumber. The shadows at the far end of the room twisted into shapes, fleeting and indistinct, but one thing was clear. The room was no longer just a hospital room. It was something else, something older, something that had been here long before the hospital itself had been built. Suddenly, a sharp, cold gust of wind blew through the cracks in the walls, and Emily's eyes darted to the bed. Thomas Walker was no longer there. The bed was empty, save for the sheet that was now thrown back, as though he had disappeared into thin air. A new figure had appeared, a tall, looming shape, indistinct but terrifying, standing at the foot of the bed. It moved toward her, its shape blurring, flickering between moments as if it was made from shadows themselves. It had no face, no features, just a black void that seemed to absorb the light around it. A voice, cold and distant, whispered in her ear, though no one was there, "You can never leave this place." Emily staggered back, her vision swimming. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the walls felt like they were closing in on her. She could hear muffled cries, whispers of people long forgotten. The very floor beneath her feet trembled, as if the building itself was alive and aware of her presence. The voice spoke again, and this time, it wasn't just in her head. It came from the figure, its voice like 1,000 whispers, all speaking at once. "It has always been here. We have always been here. The hospital is just the skin, the thing beneath it. It is what you must fear." Emily's legs buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the floor. Her mind was spinning, but she couldn't make sense of what was happening. She reached out to grab hold of something, anything, and her hand found a discarded hospital chart lying on the ground. It was a chart for an unknown patient, no name, just a number. As she stared at it, the numbers seemed to twist and writhe on the page, the ink changing before her eyes. The figure was getting closer, its shadow swallowing everything in its path. She could feel its presence, its gaze boring into her soul, and she knew with a terrible certainty that whatever it was, it had always been here. The hospital wasn't just a place for healing, it was a place where the dead lingered, where souls were trapped in endless cycles, and where something dark fed off their suffering. "You were meant to find us," the voice continued, now closer than ever. "You were meant to be the next one, the next to join us in the dark." Emily's mind snapped back to reality. She couldn't stay here any longer. She had to escape. She had to. With a final, desperate surge of strength, Emily threw herself toward the door once more. This time, the door gave way, creaking open as though it had been waiting for her to make the final move. She didn't look back as she bolted into the hallway, her heart pounding like a drum in her chest. The sound of the figure's whispering voice echoed in her ears, but she forced herself to run. She had no idea how long she ran, or where she was going. All she knew was that she had to get out of that place. Somehow, she found herself back at the elevator. She pressed the button frantically, and when the doors finally opened, she stepped inside and slammed the button for the ground floor. The elevator descended, but as it moved, Emily could have sworn she felt something move beneath her feet, something alive. The doors opened with a soft ding, and Emily stumbled out into the quiet, empty lobby. She was trembling, every part of her body shaking with the adrenaline of her escape. But as she looked back at the entrance to the hospital, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The building wasn't just silent, it was watching her. And deep inside, Emily knew she had only just begun to uncover the horror that lay behind the walls of Sterling Memorial Hospital. Don't forget to like, comment your thoughts on this terrifying story, and subscribe for more spine-chilling horror tales.